Welcome to the WealthStream podcast. The team at Hightower Great Lakes share their insights and passions for empowering their clients to live their best life. In this energetic podcast, we will take you on a journey to help you navigate your financial future, overcome life's challenges to reach your financial goals, and find the financial clarity you've been searching for. Let's explore the downstream impact of your wealth and what it means to you, your family, and your community to live greater.
Hello and welcome to the WealthStream podcast with Tim Scannell. Today, Tim is going to be going over part 4 of a series that we've been doing, looking downstream, and it's very, very interesting, and he's got a lot of great information. Tim, how are you today?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Great. I know that you said you wanted to give us kind of a recap of the other podcasts that we've done, and that would be great for our audience. So where are we starting today?
I like to help entrepreneurs, business owners prepare for eventually exiting the business and transitioning that business to wealth that hopefully can protect them for the remainder of their lives, but also helping them make sure that they maximize the return on life that money gives them, their family, and their favorite charities. And then where I really think we're unique is we also like to focus on preparing the heirs or the next generation, the beneficiaries, the favorite charities to receive that wealth. And
nice.
So I talked a little bit in the first podcast about, the first priority of creating a qualified team. And then we got into once, putting together your plan, and then as you're approaching the marketplace, being able to tweak it, adjust it on the fly. And then I think in the last podcast, we talked a little bit about really once you get to that marketplace and you're talking to buyers and, potential buyers and investment bankers, et cetera, that you really, some of the strategies that you need to implement in order to finally catch that fish or make that sale, secure the buyer.
Yeah, and I love the analogy because every fisherman's goal is to get a trophy fish, right? I mean, we want the great fish, not the smelly, crazy small fish. We want the perfect fish for us, and so I think that analogy is great and how it ties to the sale of a business. Yeah,
and so what I'd like to talk about today really is, okay, now you've sold the business, so the proceeds are coming in, and just as in when I go fishing on, fly fishing on a river, I want to make sure that the money, the fish that I'm catching, the river that I'm in, is protected for the next generation. When clients receive the proceeds from the business sale, we want to make sure that not only are we minimizing taxes and making sure everything's efficient and going to the right legal entities, but we want to help them make sure that they're protecting those dollars for them, for their family, and for future generations. To use examples of fishing, when we're in the rivers, they've got rules about catch and release. When you catch the fish, you release them. Things like using barbless hooks, and the only reason why you do that is so that it's not, you don't damage the fish when you're catching them, because then they're easier to release. And then the same thing you want to do with the money, so you receive the proceeds, you minimize taxes, and you want to use those dollars for yourselves and your family, but you also want to protect them so that they're going to be passed down to the next generation in a way that helps them.
Okay, yeah, so a barbless hook is less risk to the fish, correct?
Yeah, so when I catch the fish, when you go buy hooks at Cabela's or wherever you buy them, oftentimes there's 2 or 3 hooks on them and they have little barbs. And the problem is when you catch those fish, it can really do damage. So we try to make sure we're just using tools that create the least amount of damage and protect those fish in the streams for the next generation.
Yeah, and I love the analogy that you're using as far as preserving, because you see signs all over, depending on where you're going, like Colorado, wildlife preserve. Well, you're preserving this wealth, and that's a major piece in any plan for the future as far as heirs or what you want to fund. If you're, like you said, charities, so that's fantastic. How do we preserve that wealth?
We like to do it by, as we're going through the process, as you're creating your team, you're creating your approach, you're adjusting to the marketplace, you have this parallel path. And the parallel path is coming up with a process and using tools to prepare your heirs, prepare your family, prepare your favorite charities to ultimately receive that wealth. And one of the things I think that we do is that's a little unique is we have a wider definition, for example, of wealth. So wealth is not just your assets, your liabilities, your income. We treat wealth, and when we think about protecting wealth for future generations, we also consider, the family name, the family brand, knowledge. So obviously these business owners have learned so much and have gone through so many struggles to create this business and transition this business. I want to make sure that we can connect the legacy and the lessons and the learning and the education and preserve that for the next generation. And that, to me, that's part of the definition of wealth.
That's fantastic. I've never heard that before, and I really, really like that idea.
And then the other thing is, our definition of successful wealth transfer is really that ultimately those dollars that the beneficiaries will receive, or your charities that your favorite charities will receive, will really foster the beneficiaries' development, foster their goals, and really help them rather than hurt them. When I read about surveys, or when I talk to clients about their biggest fears about money, it's typically that the proceeds, the money that eventually they'll pass on to their kids and grandchildren or other beneficiaries will somehow hurt them, and the negative impact that money can have. And so we really focus a lot on that. We have a wealth protection process that we follow, where we walk the clients through a list of risks that are associated with receiving wealth. Risks that they're going to face, risks their children, grandchildren will face. And then we have this assessment, a 10-point checklist, where we really assess their goals, but also assess how prepared they are, not just them, but their family. For example, does the family have a mission statement that spells out their purpose of the wealth? And is everybody aware of it? Do they have family meetings? And how active or how aware are the children and grandchildren of where the money came from and how much is there? So it really helps them assess, after identifying the risks, it helps them assess, what specific risks that the family might face. And then also from there, we come up with an action plan that lists out the prioritized steps that we need to take to mitigate the risk that we've assessed for them.
All right. Sounds great.
An example of some of the tools or action plan items might be, do we have meetings or no meetings? When I say that, sometimes clients are nervous about disclosing too much information, and they're never sure whether they should tell the family about the amount of wealth or, where it came from, all that's, all the details. And like one thing we point out is that in the world of the internet and the world of Google, it's oftentimes very easy for kids, grandkids, anybody to really find out, especially with the sale of business, what's there. And typically, beneficiaries will overestimate what's there. Sometimes they will underestimate, but the reality is that I think better information is typically good. And I'm not a big fan of disclosing everything, but I do think that family meetings are a really good idea to start getting people prepared, because you're not just trying to prepare somebody to respect $1. You're trying to prepare somebody to respect $100,000 or $1 million, and that's a whole different equation.
Oh, absolutely. And just because if it's public knowledge for any reason that a business is sold and it's sold for $5 million, great. You just found that out through Google, but you have no idea what tax implications there are. You have no idea what other pieces are part of that sale. And so, like you said, the beneficiaries may be, oh my gosh, grandma and grandpa got $5 million for this business, but in reality, it's not that. And that $5 million or now $3 million, depending on how it's all set up, or $4 million, has to last grandma and grandpa, for whatever their plans are. And so it's not all just, hey, this is what we're going to hand down. Grandma and grandpa have plans for that cash. Yes, you're a part of it.
And a lot of times they don't get it all up front. They get it over time.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like you said, there's tax impact. So it's typically not, it's never what the people think about when they are looking up in Google. It's always something much more complicated. So that's why we think that more information should be shared with the people who eventually
directly
inherit it.
Yeah.
Another thing is, I think a lot of clients express this to us, and we read a lot of articles to confirm it, but there's just a lot of cultural pressure out there now. Maybe it was there before, but there's just a lot of pressure on beneficiaries or people with wealth. And there's also, responsibilities that you have when you do inherit the wealth, responsibilities maybe to give back, responsibilities to respect the money, respect the legacy. And they're not going to understand that unless they've spent time or have gone through meetings or have had communication from the parents, the sellers of the business, about what those are.
Okay, so Tim, do you have a process for your multi-generational family meetings?
We do. We have a process. It's different for every client because every client has a different need for, like some want to be more involved, some want to be less involved. Oftentimes, which is completely understandable, there's some children and grandchildren who are more active and others who are not. There's also estranged family members. There's divorces. There's complications.
Course, yeah.
So we have a very detailed family office and a family meeting checklist that we follow, and then typically we come up with a custom plan for each client.
So here's what I want to do. I want to do a podcast only on that, on what you guys do for your multi-generational family meeting, how it's kind of comprised, what goes on, and how the communication is handled. Because, it's not an easy subject. We're talking about end-of-life issues. We're talking about wants and desires from the grandparents or the parents to the children or the grandchildren. There's a lot of components there, and I would love to dive into it with you on a podcast. Can we do that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, fantastic. So that's going to be one of our future podcasts very, very soon because I really want to know what you guys do. All right, not to derail this, where are we going now?
Even if you don't want to implement a full family meeting, one of the smaller, simpler tools is to use philanthropy as a way to transfer some of your legacy, education, and history. There's tools like setting up donor-advised funds or charitable events where you can really get children and grandchildren involved, teach them about money, teach them to respect money, but at the same time transfer some of your history, legacy, and education about the family and your opinions about money to them. So that's just a simpler tool if the family office or the family meeting process is not what you want to do.
And a great question for kids or grandkids to the grandparents or parents is, why are you passionate about this specific charity? Why do you feel so connected to this charity? Because I know personally, my parents support different ones, and I know very well why they support, like the Salvation Army. We were flooded out of our home when I was, I think, 3 years old. And Salvation Army was the first ones there, giving us food and blankets and all sorts of things. We had nothing. So they're very passionate about giving back to that organization because they personally obviously impacted us. So that's a great question to be able to ask your family members.
Yeah, and oftentimes, as you would expect, kids, especially grandkids in this technological world, they think of donating, they think of money, they think of it all differently. And my favorite charity is not going to be the same charity as
Absolutely.
Any of the 5 kids I have.
Yep, that makes sense.
One of the points I mentioned earlier as it relates to the wealth protection process is really determining who is ultimately going to navigate the process. And I mention that because all my clients are different. I have clients that want to be involved in everything. They want to, once the business has been sold and now the money's coming into they're receiving the money, they want to navigate every detail of the process. I also have people who say, well, I'd like to, hire professionals and maybe follow an established process, but I don't necessarily want to do it all myself, but I still want to control it. And then other clients I have, they're really very comfortable just saying, either we will act as the driver and the navigator of the whole process and keep them totally in the loop, but we do it all. So it really just depends on the preference of the client itself.
Gotcha. What are some of the pitfalls that a family might face that you guys help navigate?
One of the biggest pitfalls we find that people face is really not thinking in advance about how the money they're receiving should be used to really improve or maximize their return on life. And I say that because a lot of time and effort is spent, especially with the advisors, by making sure it's tax efficient, it's legally protected, there's asset protection. But then the money arrives and there hasn't been a lot of thought put into, what do we do next? In addition to just maintaining our lifestyle, how do we use that money in a way that really makes sure it improves our well-being? So do we have the ability to fund our hobbies, or do we have our ability to spend time with our friends? Do we have our ability are we going to use that money to enhance relationships with our family and friends, with our favorite charities? In addition to well-being, we focus on, will that money be used for life progress? And what I mean by that is for the owners who are selling, for their children, for their grandchildren, are there plans in place to help make sure that the money will enhance their lifestyle? For example, I have a client who set up what he calls an investment or a education bank. So he has set aside a certain amount of money, and those funds will be used for education for his children and grandchildren. He's established parameters that he feels comfortable with as far as what's eligible and not. But in his mind, he's a lifelong learner, and he wants to pass that legacy on to the next generation. So he's using money to establish a fund to make sure that his children and grandchildren are progressing via learning. So, I'm excited about that. I think that was a really cool thing to work with on.
Yeah, I think that's great. Having some of those guidelines in there, like, making sure it's in a accredited college and it's not Billy Bob's fire eating school that they're going to be using, $20,000 to go to and things like that. You just want to avoid the some of the scams that are out there. And I think that grandpa or grandma being able to say, hey, this is what we want for you is so important because that's their legacy.
Yeah, exactly. And, we also talk a lot about making sure you know in advance how you're going to structure your wealth to give you the maximum amount of what we call freedom. And freedom really is just, financial security. We want to make sure that you're not stressed, that you have a plan in place, that it's protected, that you're not taking unnecessarily risks. Autonomy. This is a real big thing. I have found in working with clients, a big fear is that they don't want to be a burden on their children and grandchildren. They want to remain independent. And so we need to think well in advance, years in advance, to make sure that we're using the money to set up a plan that makes sure they're autonomous, makes sure they're independent as much as possible based on health.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. And one of the key words you said there was stress, right? If we can get rid of financial stress for not only the grandparents, but the children and maybe the grandchildren that are concerned about grandma and grandpa. And it goes back to that family meeting thing. But wow, what an impact on a family that could be just to have that security and eliminate that stress.
Yeah, and so one of the tools we use is we have a series of surveys. We call it the Return on Life Index Survey.
Okay.
And what it does is it, first of all, measures people's perspective on money. So my wife, for example, she will often say she's a product of Depression-era parents. And so she learned about debt. She learned about, savings. She learned about being efficient. And those are all things that are important for me to know as the advisor, because it helps me identify how she's going to want to treat, the money, how she's going to want to transfer money, give money, et cetera. Whereas, this generation, which is maybe not seen more, they are going to approach it a little differently. So we use a series of surveys to get perspectives on money. And Eric, as you can imagine, husband and wives have different perspectives on money too, right?
Really?
So I know in my family we do.
Yeah, mine too.
And my kids, we're all different. So it's nice to be able to identify where people learned about money, who taught them. Was it a grandparent? Was it a teacher? Or maybe they didn't get those lessons, and we identify they need them. So the first step is really trying to help identify or understand people's perspectives on money.
Yeah, getting everybody on the same page. That sounds pretty important to me.
And then finally, I guess the other big piece that we pitfalls that we try to address, or risks associated with receiving the wealth and not planning, is really focusing on what we call transition points. So a transition point could be your daughter's getting married, your son, your granddaughter is getting married. They're looking to buy a house. Somebody's looking to start a business. You personally, this is a major transition point, right? I mean, your identity has been wrapped up in this business.
Yeah.
You may be sticking around, you may not be, but in essence, you're transitioning out. You've been accumulating your whole life. You're saving, and now you're being asked to start withdrawing. I have found that psychology, that change of approach, takes 1 to 2 years for people to just get used to. I mean, it's a very psychological, traumatic event.
Yeah,
and so you really want to know that in advance and be prepared for it, and have tools that you can use to protect you from, the negatives of that.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that till you brought it up. But yeah, you've been saving and working for decades, and all of a sudden it just completely flips on you. That's got to be a shock to the system.
Yeah, and so we talk about, what are those transition points that are important to you, to your spouse, to your family, et cetera. And so we really spend a lot of time trying to help them prepare for that.
That's fantastic.
So I guess just to kind of summarize, over these 4 podcasts, we've talked about, creating the team before you even create a plan, and then creating the plan and being prepared to adjust the plan, on the fly once you really get into the marketplace. But as a parallel path, you need to create not just the financial plan, which addresses taxes and investment and rate of return and legal liability and legal entities, but you really need to focus maybe more attention to that plan that says, okay, how do I use this money to maximize my return on life for me, for the next generation? How do I use this money to really prepare my heirs, my beneficiaries, my favorite charities to receive the wealth in a way that it's going to enhance their lives versus harm them? And so we really spend a lot of time and effort on that to make sure that the wealth will be passed and it's not going to be lost 1 or 2 generations later.
Yeah, and I don't want to derail this too much here, Tim. I know we're running low on time, but can you just give us 2 questions real quick? What kind of time frame are we looking at? So we would podcast 1 through 4. There's so much information in there. If you haven't heard any of the other podcasts or the first 3 podcasts of this series, please go back and listen to them. They're very important. But give us a time frame when somebody's thinking about exiting a business. When should they be contacting you? How many years in advance? Kind of give us a time frame.
I can tell you from personal experience for me, I'm 56. I'm going to be here for a long time, but I've been working on my transition plan for 5 years.
Oh, okay.
I have found with my business owner clients, it's at least 2 to 3 years, in advance of when you're thinking of getting out.
Got it.
So I would say if you want to retire at 62, you got to start thinking about it at 55 or even before then.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And what are our last thoughts for today?
Just as a last thought is, we really do act as trusted fiduciary advisors for all of our clients. We focus a lot, not just on the clients, but their families and protecting assets for the future generations. So if you're a business owner, just like we just talked, it's never too early to start a plan. And, feel free to contact me, or another one of our certified team. There's a lot of resources on the website you can tap into, but don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions at all. Fantastic.
I'm going to go back to one other thing because I want another podcast, and I'm hoping that you can fulfill that. I want to talk about charities and philanthropy on an entire podcast. Can we do that?
Absolutely. We have a lot of experience with that and a lot of great results.
Awesome. I look forward to it. Thank you for listening to the WealthStream podcast with Tim Scannell. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Tim comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at the Downstream Podcast, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Downstream Podcast. We hope you gained some valuable insight that you can apply to your life and share with others. Please don't forget to subscribe below to be notified when new episodes become available. And don't forget to live greater. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Hightower Great Lakes. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. Hightower Great Lakes is a group of investment professionals registered with Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA and SIPC, and with Hightower Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors, LLC.